Leeds Civic Hall today, we're part of the digitally excluded, and our Wi-Fi and internet has been dropping out during calls today. So I will apologise at the start of the meeting in case that happens again during today's meeting. So I'm going to turn, when I can find it on my screen, I'm going to turn to the agenda and ask Jeanette, please, for apologies for absence.
Yes, Councillor Lewis, we've received apologies from Orla Hunt, Claire Paxman, Councillor Imran Khan and Liz Needleman.
Thank you, Jeanette. And I'll just see if anybody else in the meeting has any more apologies to pass on. Thank you. I will ask at this point, there was a meeting of the Green Jobs Task Force this morning, which is obviously relevant to the work of the committee. So I'd ask if, I think you were there, Rashik, and if anybody else on the call would just like to give us a brief update about this morning's meeting, please.
Yeah, Michelle was there as well. It was very good. The Mayor kicked off with kind of laying out her pledges and how there's a tremendous opportunity for the region. We had, must have been over 30 people on the call. The task force will meet over the next year, trying to look at ways in which education providers, local businesses can help really drive the agenda in building green jobs, both underpinning growth in the region, but also enabling the kind of the change we need to make in society. So it was good. There was a lot of it was presentation from various groups, lots of material, lots of information. Peter Glover was fantastic as normal, providing huge amounts of data, and each of the sessions provided some valuable insights. So I think that the attendees have all gone away to think about how we can contribute. So there's work to be done there, but it's an important initiative, and it really sort of underpins the Mayor's commitment to build those 1,000 new jobs in the region. And Michelle, if you want to add anything else.
Thanks, Rashik. Yeah, it was really well attended, Chair, from the private sector, education, and the public sector as well. A lot of enthusiasm for supporting the Mayor with that pledge. And I think it will be a really useful group in terms of for this committee to work with in order to test new ideas and to hold us to.
Janet, sorry, you're not telling Janet
from Consultative, and I think obviously there were a lot to do with the lease and everything. So.
Sorry, could you all put yourselves on mute if you're not speaking in this meeting, please? I'm looking at. Thank you, Bill. Sorry, Michelle, would you like to?
Sorry, James, I thought I was on mute.
No problem. You somehow must have pressed the wrong button.
I didn't want to fight over you, Bill. Yeah, so I think that's it really. I mean, with the first meeting, it's very introductory, a lot of context, sort of background in terms of what's already going on and the scale of the challenge, but also a lot of recognition for the huge opportunity that we have here in West Yorkshire with there being so much focus on this, the opportunities for our sectors to diversify, and also the existing skills provision that we've got, which gives us such a great opportunity to build on. So quite a positive meeting, really.
Thank you, Michelle. Does anybody else want to come in on this point, please? No, that's great. I'm going to move on to item 2, which is declaration of disclosable pecuniary interests. And I have a little bit of text to read out. Which
Councillor Lewis, sorry to interrupt. Can I just ask you to read out the protocol?
I'm just about to do that.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you. I was just going to say, I've got as Jeanette has just reminded me, I've got a little bit of text to read out at this point, which is the committee will be asked to make recommendations related to the adult education budget for a decision by the combined authority and by the managing director of the combined authority. under his delegations. Therefore, in the interest of transparency, all members of the committee with an interest should declare it at this point, and you will all still be able to participate in the discussion. So with that, I'll start by declaring that Leeds City Council is in receipt of the adult education budget. What I would ask is if anybody else has a declaration at this point, on this point, if you could please make it now.
Obviously, the colleges, so both myself and Nav, I guess, have the same interests in terms of adult education budget.
Thanks, Colin.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Nav.
Bradford Council also have adult education budget.
Thank you.
Yeah, so does West Yorkshire Learning Providers.
Thanks, Alex.
And I assume that Calderdale has one as well. Yep.
Please. Thank you, Sylvia. And take it that's that item covered. So for the formalities. So if nobody else has a declaration to declare there, I'll just ask if there are any other declarations of interest that anybody needs to make at this point in the meeting. Again, as this is an advisory meeting due to the virus and us meeting online, I would ask if anybody else has any declarations to make. Great. I can't see anybody. So on to item 3, which is exempt information, please. Is there any items we need to exclude the press and public for? Take it there are none. On to item 4, minutes of the meeting held on the 29th of October. And is everybody happy with those minutes? Great.
Sorry, Councillor Lewis, again, it's Jeanette again. We'll have to bring these for approval to the next meeting. So they can be noted at this one.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeanette. And we're now on to item 5, which is the Employment and Skills Delivery Programme. And Michelle, I think you're introducing this paper, please.
Yes, I am. So I assume, of course, that everybody has read the paper. We've shared with you, firstly, at the top of the paper for information, an overview graphic, which hopefully puts across to you our offer to employers, to young people and to adults in a way that sometimes our complex funding streams can make it difficult to absorb. So hopefully that's useful to you. If it's hard to read on the paper, we'd be really happy to send a slide across, and if that's something that would be useful to you in the future. In terms of specific areas in the paper that I'd like to draw your attention to, firstly, of course, the employment hubs, which you'll be aware are coordinated regionally but delivered locally through our local authority colleagues to support people into jobs and training. That the ESF funders, the European Social Funded part of that programme, is now concluded. It supported nearly 6,000 people into jobs and employment. And it was a really key part of the West Yorkshire's response to certainly the earlier stages of the pandemic, where we saw large numbers of people either on furlough or unemployed. It's really positive that programme, or that the support for people into employment and training through that employment hub model, is being continued through the devolved funding, which is known as gain share. So we continue to work really closely with the local authorities on that same, in the same way, really. So the regional coordination, but that local delivery and local route to engagement, particularly to ensure that we reach those most disadvantaged communities. Also wanted to mention the Future Goals Careers platform, which many of you will have seen. Really high levels of engagement, reached nearly 2.5 million people so far this financial year. That is soon to have an add-on in order to support people to access employment opportunities. So really building on its functionality going forward. A few things on adult training, so adult upskilling and retraining in particular. So the Skills Connect programme was launched just before Christmas, just before Christmas. So hopefully you saw that. That programme provides free training for adults in West Yorkshire to upskill and retrain. It's delivered at a West Yorkshire level, recognising the cross local authority patterns of travelling to work and travelling to learn as well. But we're working really closely with local authority colleagues in particular to ensure that we're able to reach people from diverse and disadvantaged backgrounds, and that we've got some really good route to engagement through local provision to that support. Also under that Skills Connect brand, with Mayoral combined authority areas have been invited by the Department for Education to bid for 12 months of funding to deliver adult skills boot camps. Now, these are quite prescriptive in format. They're 12 to 16 weeks, very intensive provision with clear line of sight to a job. We've been working very quickly because we only found out about this opportunity after Christmas, with a very tight deadline of the 28th of January. So we've been working very quickly on that bid to make sure that residents of West Yorkshire are able to benefit from this opportunity. We've tested some proposed areas with our local authority colleagues and with some of the employers on this call as well. And our intention is to submit a bid that provides sufficient specificity about what we'd want to cover, but also adequate flexibility to respond to changes in the labour market as they come along, because we all know that there's so much flux at the moment. So we are still really keen to receive letters of support from our employers, and my colleagues Carly Bowden and Francis Butterworth will be approaching you individually outside of this, so please do expect emails from them. I'm not going to talk about the adult education budget here because we'll be coming on to that in the next paper, but we are working really closely with colleagues and local authorities in particular to ensure that we join the adult education budget provision up with that wider upskilling and retraining offer, because between the two of those we've got a really fantastic offer to employers here in West Yorkshire, to individuals here in West Yorkshire, and the unique opportunity to create a talent pipeline for our employers. Beyond Brontes, this committee hasn't heard much about before because it's previously sat under culture committees, but it's absolutely of direct interest to you. So this is the Mayor's Screen the Skills Diversity programme delivered by Bradford Council and Screen Yorkshire, which is attracting people from diverse and disadvantaged backgrounds to careers in the screen industry. And it's been heavily oversubscribed, which I think shows how much appetite there is to progress into careers in that sector. And finally, our school partnerships activity. So we now have twice as many schools in West Yorkshire part of careers hubs than we had 12 months ago, working together to embed good careers practice and supporting young people from our most disadvantaged backgrounds into positive careers destinations. We're also keen at the moment to recruit new enterprise advisors, which are the names for, it's a name used by our funder to describe employers who are working with schools at a strategic level to support careers education. We've got Tim here today who's going to present the findings of an evaluation into some of our school partnerships activity. So I will pass back to the chair to ask whether you want me to pause there or pass straight to Tim for that.
Thank you, Michelle. What I want to suggest, because obviously there's a lot of people on the call, if anybody, before we pass over to Tim, I'll just ask if anybody's got any questions and comments to make at this point. Can't see anybody's electronic or actual hand up. So shall we go on to Tim, please?
Thank you, Chair. Jeanette, I've got a few slides that I sent across. Would you like me to share my screen, or would you rather do that? Maybe, I'm not sure if Jeanette can hear me. Can other colleagues hear me? Okay.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen, we've opened the access for you.
Yeah, I will do that. Thank you. Okay, hopefully colleagues can see that slide there. But my name is Tim Allen from a company called York Consulting. We're actually we're a Leeds-based company, and we specialise in research and evaluation in a small number of areas of policy, and central amongst those is education, skills and employment, and that's been the case for over 30 years. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share with you some of the headline findings from an evaluation that we completed looking at a suite of enterprise and education activities. It's worth just saying a couple of points up front. One is that these are selected findings. The report, I understand, was circulated with the papers for this meeting. That says everything that I'm going to say and more besides, and goes into further detail. I'm going to go through some of the headlines at a fair pace. The second point is, it's worth saying this was a pretty operational piece of work. We were tasked with looking at the operations and outcomes of 4 specific strands of activity, kind of at ground level. So it intentionally wasn't a specifically strategically focused piece, and that will become apparent when I step through the findings over the next few minutes. I do hope nonetheless, though, that the findings are of interest and relevance to colleagues in attendance. Okay, so just a quick bit of scene setting. I'm not sure how familiar colleagues are with the strands of activity that were in scope, so I shall do a kind of 1-sentence summary of each. So we were asked to look at raising aspirations. Raising aspirations was, at the time that we were looking at it, a funding pot of around about £350,000 into which schools could bid to design and deliver projects with the aim of increasing social mobility for disadvantaged young people, and in particular giving them more and better meaningful employer experiences and encounters. The Enterprise Advisor Network, Michelle's just referred to this national programme, essentially business volunteers supporting schools and colleges with careers and careers guidance. Kirklees Careers Hub, partnership of schools and other education providers working with employers with the aim of improving outcomes and driving up performance against the Gatsby benchmarks of good careers guidance. And the 4th strand that was within our scope is the Send Careers Hub. So a similarly collaborative model to the Kirklees Hub, but with a specific focus on supporting young people with special educational needs and or disabilities. I'm actually going to only cover the first 3 today. That's not to talk down the great importance of the Send Hub. It does have its own chapter in the report, but I need to have one eye on the clock. And not only that, the majority of the research work that we did focusing on the Send Hub was done pre-COVID. So our knowledge base is slightly less current. Okay. We had lots of research questions to answer, but in summary, we were looking at 4 main things. Effectiveness, so how effectively have these interventions been delivered? Added value and additionality, which is just a posh way of saying to what extent would these outcomes have occurred anyway had we not put this funding in place. Outcomes and impacts, pretty self-explanatory, although not that easy to measure, more of which later. And we also wanted to identify some pointers for the combined authorities and their partners for how they might take forward some of this activity in the future. Okay, the elapsed time period for the work was nearly 2 years. Although we had a COVID driven sort of hiatus from March, April 2020 through to early 2021. So we weren't working on the evaluation for that full period. It was a combination of primary research, so speaking with people, and secondary analysis, looking at data, and we got input from a really broad range, and I've given some examples there: enterprise advisors, coordinators, students in schools, and others besides. So a pretty kind of broad church. I'll come on to the findings in just one second, but it's worth saying one of the strengths of this piece of work, in my opinion, was that we looked across different strands of activity. We didn't just focus on one. One of the weaknesses of this piece of work was that very same thing. It was a relatively small piece of work, and we therefore found ourselves spreading ourselves quite thinly across these 4 strands. So I think there's some strong messages that have come through, but I can't pretend that we can be especially authoritative on impact, but I'll say more about that shortly. Okay, what I've now got is a couple of slides that I'll step through briefly on each of the 3 main strands that we looked at in the work, and I'm going to start with raising aspirations. It's quite a busy slide, so I'm just going to draw colleagues' attentions to a couple of key points. And the first of those is the second block of text on the left-hand side, where we say that we think our data set isn't fully complete, but we think that around 5,300 disadvantaged pupils experience direct employer encounters. Now that as a number in isolation doesn't really mean very much. So to give it some context, that is about 81% of the original target that was set for raising aspirations, and that target was set pre-COVID. And it's our view as evaluators that to achieve that, given the constraints, not least the very limited face-to-face contact that existed in education, business, and elsewhere, to achieve that actually through these projects is pretty impressive. On the right-hand side, I've listed some of the kinds of things that were funded through raising aspirations. And I think the combined authority deserves some credit here, because this really wasn't just a regurgitation of stuff that's been done umpteen times before. So yes, there are some tried and tested activities here that we've seen in other programs, but there's some genuinely new and innovative things that were funded, perhaps none more so than the virtual reality and the 360 employer experiences for young people for whom an actual in-person visit would have been uncomfortable or impossible. And we talk more about these in the report, but it's certainly my view that this wasn't just same old. Okay, what do we think about some of the outcomes this strand generated? Well, we can say for certain that this funding has resulted in careers education being targeted at disadvantaged students. The significance of that is because that's front and center in the aims of raising aspirations. Almost all of the school staff and the students that we spoke with said we strongly believe that the students that have taken part in these activities will be able to make more informed choices. And a similarly high proportion of people that kindly gave us their time said we have been able to give disadvantaged students more exposure to employers than would otherwise have been the case. I would love to do a sort of drum roll and now say that I can evidence that in more measurable, tangible terms via improvements in the Gatsby benchmarks. We can't, sadly, because what's actually happened is during COVID, it's been incredibly difficult for schools to maintain the same level of careers provision for young people. So we can't say for certain that that we've made an impact on the Gatsby benchmarks, but the strong weight of evidence is that raising aspirations has been extremely beneficial. Okay, similar slide on the Enterprise Advisor Network. Again, I'll just draw colleagues' attention to a couple of things here. In the top left, when we did the work mid-2021, when we were doing our final analysis, about 70% of the state-funded schools were matched to an enterprise advisor across the city region. That's good, but there is evident headroom for improvement going forward. One of the things that struck me when I was doing this research was that it appears that the relationship between private sector enterprise advisors and the schools with whom they had been matched actually improved over the evaluation period despite COVID. there's a number of reasons for that, but central amongst them is that the combined authority introduced a new induction process based on a lot of consultation work. A new induction process for enterprise advisors, which far more clearly stipulated the expectations and parameters of the role, and that seems to have paid dividends. Okay, in the bottom left there, we talk about the definition of the enterprise advisor role. In theory, it's a strategic role. It's about working with schools to develop career strategies. It's about broadening networks of employer contacts. Some employers like doing that, but actually most of them, they much prefer designing activities and getting their hands dirty in activities with schools. And that's the same the country over. That's not unique to the combined authority area. But one of the observations or recommendations that we made in our report was just to ensure that when we're recruiting new and enthusiastic enterprise advisors, that they are also willing to do the strategic side of the role as well. Okay. Outcomes associated with the network. There's some intentional weasel words here. I talk about some evidence. I talk about stronger links appearing to exist. That's just because our evidence base isn't particularly deep on the enterprise advisor network. However, we do have evidence that as a consequence of this activity, we're seeing careers education in some cases becoming more embedded in curriculum delivery. We've seen relationships improving between enterprise advisors and schools, and recognizing that correlation doesn't equal causality, what we also see is that against the relevant two benchmarks, 5 and 6, we see average scores being higher amongst those schools that are matched with an enterprise advisor than those that are not. And although I can't prove it in laboratory conditions, I would contest that the network has made a significant contribution to that. Couple more from me. On the Kirklees Careers Hub, I have to say it's an all-round good news story here. High levels of engagement from schools and colleges. Almost all of those involved in the network have taken part in some form of CPD. The vast majority are matched with an enterprise advisor. Staff have clearly welcomed opportunities for collaboration and partnership building. There's no doubt about that. And in terms of outcomes, what we see is that between 2019 and 2021, across 8 of these Gatsby benchmarks, average scores amongst those participating schools have improved. Now, obvious question, was that the hub in full or in part doing that? I don't have a control group, sadly, so I don't know for certain. But again, based on the work we've done, I would suggest it has made a contribution. Staff in schools talked to us about the hub now having a clearer vision about it being focused, of it being purposeful. And I think that's down to the coordination role at the combined authority combined with local level delivery. And they talk about a genuinely collaborative feel of being involved in the development of resources and materials. So final slide, and I appreciate, colleagues, I've done that at quite some pace, but there was a few points that I wanted to make. What did we conclude in the report? Well, we concluded this suite of activities represents a valuable addition to the careers landscape and one that has been well and attentively managed over the period and scope that we looked at. On COVID constraints, it would have been very easy for the combined authorities, local authorities, and or schools to sort of sit on their hands and park this kind of work until it was easier to deliver. Not a bit of it, not a bit of it. I think the needs and opportunities of the young people have been at the forefront of all stakeholders' minds, and a great deal of work has taken place in them in very trying circumstances. Dead weight appears to be low. That just means that we don't think that all of these things would have happened anyway if you hadn't funded it. And as you've heard me say already, and I should just reassert, we're independent and we're objective. We're not here to say nice things if they don't exist or to shy away from challenges, but we can see a range of positive outcomes. Good practice in delivering presentations like this dictates I should end on a positive. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to end by saying that everything that I've said is true. I would love to be able to show you measurable impact on a graph or something. It's hard for me to do that for the reasons that I've given before, but I remain very confident that each of the strands we've looked at has done good things. So thank you, Chair. That's all I wanted to say in terms of the formal part of the presentation, and I hope colleagues found that useful.
Thank you, Tim. I will ask if anybody in the meeting has any questions or comments at this point. I know the actions we're asked to do is to note the reports. Like I say, if there are any comments to make. Councillor Brooks, please.
Thank you so much for the report, Tim. It was really well written and really interesting. So thank you. I suppose like a concern is that it's only considering the impact of the work through the enterprise partnership programs. Could have been broader to have like a broader overview of what's going on across the district, just to make sure that there's no sort of doubling up, and just ensuring that the funding put forward is complementing work already done, or identifying areas where work's being done really well and supporting areas where work isn't being done so well and maybe needs a bit more support. So like, if like, I don't know, like maybe in future we could look at looking at the overall strategic approach around it, and just trying to like support the overarching strategy rather than like sort of bits of it. Like I understand that it's a really big bit of work, but I feel quite strongly that it's important that we have a really good overview of what's already being done.
Thank you. Would you like to come back, please, Tim?
Yes, I will do, Chair. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yes. So in terms of sort of championing what has worked well and what may be suitable for replication elsewhere, what we've done, and thank you for reading the report, we've included some examples of what we consider to be effective practices as case studies in the appendix, specific to the Raising Aspirations project, and those are things that we think have got innovation woven into the design and success woven into the delivery. But I take your point and can't really challenge the assertion that there's merit in doing a sort of broader landscape review here, and is something that I'd advise the combined authorities do in future studies. We did look very much at activities happening in isolation, although having said that, we were very keen to ask staff in schools that we spoke with and other stakeholders, is this just simply replacing stuff that you would do anyway, or is it funding stuff that was already happening? So we did ask that question, and the answer was, generally speaking, no. The majority of what we're doing here has been enabled and facilitated by the provision of the funding. But I fully accept the point that a more sort of panoramic view would also be useful.
Thank you, Tim. And Councillor Dacre, would you like to come in, please?
Yes, thank you, and thanks for the report. And it's really more a comment generally about the Kirklees Careers Hub. Clearly that's now got Calderdale contained within it, and it was just to say that so far they've said that the Calderdale officers have said they felt that the incorporation's gone really well, and so I hope that in the future that's going to benefit Calderdale, those young people who need the careers advice. And I think Calderdale had been doing some of this anyway, but I hope that they'll now be able to do it more efficiently through that hub.
Thank you. And David Cooper, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I actually lead or help lead the Kirklees Careers Hub, and have been involved since its inception. I think we're into the 4th year now. My school also benefited from the Raising Aspirations pilot, and I think just to put that in context, the feedback's very, very welcome and valuable. But the pilot was in midstream when the first lockdown happened. So the fact that schools have been able to take that commitment and actually develop that extra piece of work in the times that we live through, I think is phenomenal. And certainly all the feedback I've had in addition to this has been that it's really added value. Just one general comment I think would be that, I think through this kind of research and feedback, we're really honing down what does work and what does have an impact. So there's a great launch pad to actually continue some of this work and develop a medium to long-term strategy, because I think that's often the frustration in education. A lot of initiatives are very much short-term, and I think we've got a great opportunity to build on some of this work now. Thank you.
Great, thank you, David. That's really useful feedback. Before we finish this item, I'll just see if anybody else would like to come in, or Michelle, if you want to say anything before we turn to the recommendations. I don't see anybody else wanting to come in, so we'll turn to the recommendations to note the report and then move on to item 6, which is the adult education budget. And I'll ask Lindsay to introduce this item in a moment. Just as a little reminder, this is a consultative meeting that's been held online. We can't make decisions because we're online, but anybody who has an interest in this item, please, if you haven't declared it yet, please do declare it. If not, we'll move on to Lindsay. Could I ask you to introduce this paper, please?
Thank you, Chair. We appreciate it's a fairly weighty paper, the adult education budget that we provided. So there are 3 main components, and I'll just sort of briefly give a summary of each area. The first is an update on delivery performance. We've provided quite a detailed Appendix A, so we won't delve into that detail, but in terms of headlines, we've supported over 23,000 residents who've now accessed training provided by these funds, and around a fifth of those have been supported through community learning, which involves substantial more outreach. As expected, for the level of learning and the type of learner that we're trying to support with this funding, the bulk of the training provided has been preparation for life and work, although we have seen some sector-focused programs as well. We've seen a real increase in the ESOL delivery, so that's for speaking English as a second language. In comparison to previous years, we've seen quite huge demand coming in for that. In terms of funding, slightly behind on provider profiles. However, our next data return, which lands within the next kind of 10 days, will give us a lot more information on the wider AEB funded delivery, like community learning and learner support that facilities that are in there. And it'll again really increase our understanding of that funding usage and the performance against target. But I'm sure you can see from the last data pack that was provided in the previous committee, we've really moved forward significantly since the RO2 report that was provided last time, and far more activity is being reported. The second component of the paper is just an update on the partnership work that's been undertaken with the aim of advancing the AEB strategy. So again, as noted in the paper, once we'd managed to sort of set up the more logistical components of AEB, we've been able to now focus more on those strategic aims of devolved adult education budget. Specifically, the partnership work with stakeholders, and particularly involving the local authorities in their place shaping role. So the paper outlines a range of activity that's taken place, including a strategic skills workshop with directors of development, multiple conversations that we've had at officer level, which was following a paper that had been drafted by Leeds and Bradford on behalf of all the colleges and councils, and then helpfully distilled into 11 asks. So again, a very detailed Appendix B provided for you, which I think hopefully demonstrates the depth of the work and the consultations that have been held since the last meeting. But it outlines in the first column the 11 asks that came forward. These are things such as linking into local governance arrangements, flexibilities and innovation that we might want to introduce into funding. Now it's evolved, we have more control and design over it. Stability in the system and the importance of community learning are also form part of those asks. So in the other columns, hopefully you can see, alongside those asks, we, the combined authority, then proposed how we could move forward collectively with AEB, and these proposals have been shaped and discussed and widely agreed with stakeholders. So building on this piece of work, which is highly specific to AEB, there's also a bit of appetite to develop high-level operating principles, which could be determined between the mayoral combined authority and the local authorities, and how that might affect future devolved streams. So there'll be an office of discussion held ahead of coming back to the committee regarding those high-level principles. Also, perhaps worth updating that since the paper was written, we've also begun much more detailed conversations with stakeholders on some potential funding flexibilities, which would help improve the impact of AEB for our residents. We're currently looking at evidence-based and approval routes for those. We'll likely, I suspect, provide another fairly weighty paper to the committee next meeting on those. So the final section it proposes a series of recommendations for the committee to make. So I think firstly, just picking up on Councillor Lewis's comments, on the Chair's comments, it does need to be minuted that the paper asks the committee to approve when it should say recommend within recommend the proposals that have been put forward. As we've said, the final approval will be one of two routes. One is through the combined authority, and I'll point out which of those recommendations it is as we go through, and the other are for the managing director. Again, just as an update, since the paper's been written, in light of the Employment and Skills Committee becoming a decision-making committee, we are currently reviewing a decision-making document was made specifically for AEB during the point of implementation when the committee was a panel. So we are reviewing that decision-making delegation template, and that is likely to be drafted to go to the combined authority in March. Just so you're aware about that, mapping it against the new terms of reference for this committee. So in terms of the recommendations themselves, the first one is to introduce an end-of-year financial tolerance for grant providers. So this is the recommendation that would go to the combined authority for final approval, because it is a departure from the AEB strategy as we'd initially written it. But the change is very much in response to calls from the provider base and aims to reduce the bureaucracy and uncertainty involved in end-of-year reconciliation, and also the context in which we're working. Although you know, we hopefully after Omicron hopefully feel as though we're coming out of the pandemic again, that is still affecting learner confidence on enrolling with programs, particularly the hard to reach. And I think it's, you know, as we've noted in the paper, it's important to understand that context in which providers are working. The next set of recommendations are about contract growth and underperformance, and these really do just build on the existing performance management framework. So as such, they just provide metrics and criteria in which the operational AEB will then be able to enact the changes that we need to reward success and just ensure that any unspent money can be reallocated in year. The provider stability recommendations just recognise the contribution really that AEB provider base have made in working with the combined authority to improve AEB usage in West Yorkshire. So we're aiming to provide a 3-year notional agreement to grant providers, and also propose that the current cohort of contract for service holders are continued to 22-23 and extended to 23-24. Obviously dependent on funding availability and dependent on provider performance. Both of these measures are really just about supporting the long-term and meaningful planning of AEB for those providers and for ourselves. The recommendation regarding the responsiveness pot proposes to use this pot firstly to award contract growth for successful providers who are delivering in line with AEB strategy, and then also to utilise it to procure specific calls as needs emerge. Currently, we're looking at proposals possibly around ESOL provision. As mentioned, we're seeing significant demand in that area, digital access, addressing the bus driver shortage, and green skills, although I will note that that last section is obviously in line and certainly in tandem with the work of the Green Skills Task Force. So we will be looking for that group to inform that activity. We'll also be working with local authority colleagues to understand any acute local needs as well, and that would come from the responsibility. The final recommendation is regarding the Free Skills for Jobs funds. And that's Free Skills for Jobs is sort of the government rebrand of what we previously referred to as the Lifetime Skills Guarantee, which is the level 3 offer through the National Skills Fund. Important to note that this is delegated funding, so we don't have the same ability to flex as we do with AEB. But so in terms of performance, as we note in the paper, the utilisation of the funds is quite low. That's in line with national and other Mayoral Combined Authority reports, perhaps an indicator of why the eligibility is expanding in April. And hence we've kind of looked at some ways that we might be able to unlock a little bit more of that funding this year. As I said, it's a delegated fund, which would mean that any unspent funds would go back at the end of the year. So the recommendation is to allow existing grant providers to subcontract where they've got a strategic rationale for that, to open up the funds to other grant holders who can submit a business case for delivery, and then to plan a procurement round for April when the eligibility expands, which will open up the funding to a wider provider base. So as mentioned, a very weighty paper and lots of recommendations to consider. Perhaps important to note that all of the recommendations have been shared and certainly shaped through consultation with stakeholders and the provider base, all as part of the partnership work that we mentioned in that second section there. So I'm happy to take any questions on the detail, and I'll pass back to the chair.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was a really comprehensive update for us. And as you mentioned, some of the issues that were raised at the last meeting have been taken forward certainly between the local authorities and reflected in this report. There's quite a lot in the report. So what I'm going to suggest is if anybody has any specific questions and comments, I'll take those now, and then we'll turn to the recommendations that we've been asked to pass on for approval by officers. So if there's any questions or comments, please, if you could put your electronic hand up, and I'll see if anybody is waving at me as well. I don't see anybody wanted to come in at this point. So in terms of the ask that we recommend these points to go forward, as well as noting the report, I will take it that everybody is happy with that recommendation, and we'll move on to the I can't see anybody indicating they're not. Nav, would you like to come in, please? So you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just one point on the access for free courses for jobs funds. I think as we introduce new providers, I just think it's important that we don't open up competition with existing providers that might decrease people's ability to deliver their contracts. So I'm all for opening up access to skills pots where they're available, but I just think we need to keep in our mind that we don't want to undermine other contracts that we've got out, including things like gain share funding, by the provision of anything new. And just a quick point, really, thanks to Lindsay and her team for coping with devolution of AEB, because it hasn't been straightforward. There have been some bumps on the road, but we are getting there. So just so that's in the minutes somewhere.
Thank you for those comments. Thank you for those comments, Nav. It's been an interesting time for all of us. Like I say, if there's nobody else wants to come in, or nobody has any more comments on the recommendations, we'll take those as in terms of the paper recommended by this advisory meeting, and we'll move on to item 7, please, and I'll ask Peter Glover to come in. Peter, please.
Thank you, Chair. So this item is about the local skills report. So a covering paper and the draft local skills report itself have been provided as an appendix in your papers. So what we're asking the committee to provide comments on the report, excuse me, but also to sign off the draft report before we publish it, subject to any comments that they may have. In terms of background, the local skills report is something that we're required to produce as part of our memorandum of understanding with the Department for Education. And that MOU relates to the committee's work as a skills advisory panel for West Yorkshire. So it's a nominated body for identifying skills needs and leading them the response to them locally. So the report was originally published in March of last year, but we're required to publish an update, and that is notionally by the end of January. But there is some flex in that timing if there are major comments from the committee that we need to take account of. So the purpose of the report is to provide an overview of the work of the Skills Advisory Panel, which includes a summary of West Yorkshire skills needs, an overview of the strategy and action plan for addressing those, also the approach to economic recovery, and then the progress made in taking forward the skills agenda in West Yorkshire. So it's a light touch updates within the report, but we have added material about the transition from panel status to committee status within there, and obviously the role of the mayor, who's been elected since the original report was published, and also the role of her pledges in respect of the employment and skills agenda. So in some ways, the report, the main audience for the report is the Department for Education themselves, but that is the kind of background to the report. What we're asking for is any comments on the report and ultimately approval to publish it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Peter. Are there any questions and comments from the committee? I'm just looking through to see whether anybody's got an electronic hand or is waving at me, and I can't see anybody. So, Nav.
Thanks, Chair. I think somebody ought to say something. Thanks very much for the report as ever, Peter. Do you think the report addresses that idea of replacement demand sufficiently? And you know, we talk about skills required for new, bright and shiny things like green and digital and whatever, but most job designations are looking for replacement demand, even for those kind of old-fashioned jobs, like bus drivers came out of left field just recently. Do you think that we've captured that need across the piece for bog standard replacement demand, or do you think it's not relevant?
I think it is relevant, Nav. I mean, what I should say, another important bit of context is that this is a summary report and it sits alongside our labour market report and other technical information where there's more detailed analysis of things like replacement demand. But I think your point's well made, and we can certainly make sure that it features more within the local skills report. So we'll add a little bit of coverage of that within the report prior to publication.
Yeah, thanks. Because I do think sometimes we get to the point where we get funding, or funding's targeted at those bright new shiny jobs, but it could be that there's nothing wrong with new gardeners, for example. It doesn't always count as a green job, surprisingly enough.
Thank you, Nav. If anybody's got the final definition of a green job, please let me know. But you're right, there are some roles that definitely have a green aspect to them. Amanda, would you like to come in, please?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment, as always with Peter's work, the quality of that report, the detail, etc., is exceptional. I particularly like the plan on a page bit because I'm all for visualization. I think a lot of the work the committee looks at is very, very detailed, and I just think that's a really great way of summarising it. So I just wanted to say well done and gets my thumbs up.
Thank you. Is there anybody else that wants to come in? And I take it as there isn't, that we are happy to agree to recommend that the report is approved and move forward. So we'll move on to item 8, which is the State of the Region update, please, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I think Sophie is about to share a slide deck, hopefully. Excellent. Could you just scroll on one slide, please, Sophie? So the covering paper to this item is contained in your pack, but we circulated this deck after the committee papers went out. And we did that so we could draw on the latest information, but hopefully people made the connection in their email inbox about the two that it relates to this committee. So within this presentation, I'm going to cover 2 aspects. So first of all, the latest position regarding the high-level state of the region indicators that we cover relating to employment and skills, plus an update based on more timely indicators relating to the labour market. So the latest information available, essentially. So some of the state of the region indicators haven't changed since we last reported to the committee. So no new data has become available for them in the interim, but they're still in the pack for the sake of completeness. But I won't cover them in the commentary, but if anybody has any questions on them, obviously happy to deal with those. So within the state of the region, then we're looking at refreshed data for employment, unemployment, real living wage and apprenticeships. Next slide, please, Sophie. So first of all, employment. So what's happened to employment since the kind of state of the region was published? So one of the key sources for labour market information is the annual population survey. And that provides the official measure of employment at local level, which we're presenting here. So from that source, although updated figures are released each quarter, these figures are based on an average for the preceding 12 months. So the latest period is October 2020 to September 21. So we can't really pick up on sort of month-to-month changes through that source linked to developments like Omicron. As I said, though, it is the official source. And what we can see from this analysis is that the level of employment in West Yorkshire peaked in the run up to the pandemic and has fallen slightly since. So that's represented by the columns, the sort of bluish columns and green columns in the chart. But the employment rate, which is the proportion of people of working age in a job, has also fallen. But the more positive aspect is that the gap with the national average is much smaller than it was during previous years. So we can see a real narrowing of the gap in terms of employment performance. Next slide, please, Sophie. So the second kind of refreshed aspect I like to look at is unemployment. And again, we're using the official measure that is used in State of the Region. And these figures actually, again, relate to October 2020 to September 2021. They're an average of that period. The last time we reported on unemployment figures at the October committee meeting, the unemployment rate for West Yorkshire was level with the national average. As you can see from this chart, a small gap has appeared since then, with the relative position of West Yorkshire worsening slightly. What you can also see is that most local authorities have rates above the national average in West Yorkshire, with Bradford being well above, but the exception is Wakefield, which is slightly below. So that's the latest unemployment position. Next slide, please. So we have new information in respect of the real living wage for 2021. And that information shows us that the proportion of jobs paid below the real living wage level, and you can see the levels on the chart there for the 2 years. The proportion paying below that level has fallen from 20% in 2021 to 18% in 20% in 2020 to 18% in 2021 in West Yorkshire. So that still means that we've got 170,000 jobs in West Yorkshire that pay below the real living wage. And it's still 1 percentage point higher than the national average, but still positive progress. If we look at local authority level, Kirklees still has the highest proportion of jobs that are paid below the real living wage at 22%, but there's been a big fall of 7 percentage points compared with 2020. So an across the board improvement. So what's driving that improvement in low pay in terms of this measure? So according to ONS, it coincides with increases in the national minimum wage and national living wage rates that the government sets. And there's also been an additional increase in the national minimum wage for those aged 23 and 24 years of age. So they've joined the 25-year-olds and over in receiving the national living wage in 2021. So that policy change around low pay has had a kind of tangible impact on the sort of prevalence of low pay within West Yorkshire. So Sophie, can you skip the next slide, please? Yep, that's it. So apprenticeships now. Since the last meeting of the committee, we've received finalised apprenticeship data that covers the full 2020 to 21 academic year. And it shows that the number of starts in the year in West Yorkshire was pretty much unchanged compared with 2019-20 at 14,530. That's for West Yorkshire. Total starts during 2020 to 21 were around 23% lower than pre-pandemic, which is 2018-19. And as you can see from the chart, all segments of apprenticeship provision are below their pre-pandemic level, or they were during 2020 to 21. The only exception is higher apprenticeships, which were 22% higher. The biggest falls compared with the pre-pandemic position were for under 19s, so apprenticeships for under 19s, which were down by 30%. And also intermediate apprenticeships where starts were down by 43%. So you can see that the disruption caused by the pandemic fed through into the 2020 to 21 academic year. And there's plenty of ground to be made up during the course of this academic year. Sophie, can you now skip to the next sort of title slide? So the slides we're skipping are the ones where there isn't any refreshed data. So I don't think we need to comment on those, but they're there for reference, basically. So what I'm turning to now is the more timely information around the labour market situation. Next slide, please, Sophie. And I think it's, sorry, can you go back one? Thank you. So I think it's useful to look at the national context because it gives us more timely and detailed information that's not available to local level, and it provides some additional insight, which I think is useful. So first of all, the employment rates. This is more recent data than is available for West Yorkshire, and it shows a continuing increase. So between in the September to November period, it grew by 0.2 percentage points to 75.5%, but that is still 1.1 percentage points below the pre-pandemic level. So there is still ground to be made up on employment at national level. The big driver for employment growth in recent months has been part-time employment, which fell quite markedly during the pandemic, but now is now recovering quite strongly. Unemployment, that is decreasing, and it's down to 4.1% now, according to the latest figures. So it's only 0.1 percentage points above the pre-pandemic position. So we're nearly back to where we were in terms of unemployment. Vacancies in the economy continue to grow, and they hit record levels again, according to the latest data. So there were 1.3 million vacancies during the October to December 2021 period. That's nearly 500,000 higher than pre-pandemic. There is some sign in the latest monthly data that rate of growth is now slowing. Another key development is that the number of people who are economically inactive also grew during the September-November period. And that's due to older people leaving the labour market, often for health-related reasons. And that is widening the participation gap that we mentioned at the last meeting and constraining the supply of labour to employers. So we're seeing a tightening of the labour market, and that's reflected in the fact that we've got a ratio of vacancies to every 100 employees of 4.1. That's a record. That's the highest ratio on record of vacancies to employee jobs. And the ratio of vacancies to the count of unemployed people is almost 1-to-1 now. So that's a further indication of the tightening. At the same time, though, average earnings adjusted for inflation are now falling. So in November, they were 1% lower than the year earlier. So that tightening of the labour market isn't seeing an increase, a real increase in pay, because it's being offset by inflation. Next slide, please, Sophie. So turning now to employment. So it's important to note this measure of employment differs from the employment statistics we looked at under the state of the region section. It's not the official measure. It relates to the count of payroll employees whose information is captured by HMRC, but it does give a more timely picture of the employment trajectory. And we expect that to see that reflected in the official measure of employment in due course. What we can see is that, and this chart shows you an index of the employment level with a benchmark of 2019, which is represented by the horizontal line. And as we saw last time, there's been a recovery in employment on this measure with a return to pre-pandemic levels in West Yorkshire and all local authorities from spring of 2021 onwards. So all areas of West Yorkshire recovered more strongly than the national average, which you can see reflected in the sort of black line in the chart. But there's some sign that Bradford and Leeds are pulling away slightly in terms of the strength of their employment recovery, although the differences are small, and it sort of remains to be seen whether that will be sustained. Next slide, please, Sophie. So we turn now to the claimant count, and this gives us a timely measure of people who are out of work, but it's not the official measure of unemployment. It's a count of people on benefits, basically. And what we can see is a continuation of the trend that we observed at the last meeting of steady reduction in claimants. So there was a further fall of 2% in the number of claimants between November and December of 2021. So we now have about 80,000 claimants on the books in West Yorkshire. And that's about 27% or 29,000 lower than in March 2021, which was the peak. But it's still 42% higher than pre-pandemic in February 2020. So there are still some improvements to be made. And the situation is more stubborn in Bradford and Leeds in terms of the claimant count than the other local authorities. So in Bradford, the claimant count is still 49% higher than pre-pandemic. In Leeds, it's 47% higher. Whereas in Calderdale, it's only 31% high. So there are some differences in the rate of recovery. We've got about 15,000 young people aged 16 to 24 who are claiming jobless benefits, and that's down from a peak of 23,000. So the number of young jobless people is actually, or the young jobless claimants has actually fallen more quickly by about 37% since its peak in March, but it's still 29% higher than in February 2020, so than pre-pandemic. Next slide, please, Sophie. So turning now to what's happening with the recruitment activity, and the most timely measure of that is online job postings. So what the chart shows is the weekly count of online job postings for West Yorkshire. And some of the key takeaways are the number of vacancies advertised online has been above pre-pandemic levels since the early part of 2021, and was given impetus by the lifting of restrictions in the summer. What you can see, though, is that during December and the early part of January, there was quite a steep fall in the count of vacancies for West Yorkshire. That's partly because I think the really high levels that we saw in November were unlikely to be sustainable, and there's also the festive period effect. But I think there was also a slowing of recruitment activity due to Omicron and the Plan B announcement. But what you can also see is the start of a recovery in the last couple of weeks as vacancies started to grow again. And we've got figures for February, week ending January 22nd as well now, and they show a continued recovery. So hopefully we've seen a short-lived sort of reduction in recruitment activity. Next slide, please, Sophie. And this basically shows you the position in terms of recruitment activity and online job postings by local authority. We've used an index here to get over the disparities in the sort of scale of recruitment activity. Again, you can see there was a decline in all local authorities during December. reflecting Omicron partly. But we can also see that there's been a recovery across the board as well during January. What you can also see prior to December is that Calderdale and Leeds were seeing the fastest recovery once restrictions were lifted. Meanwhile, Kirklees, Wakefield and Bradford are following a very similar pattern to the trajectory of the national recovery towards the bottom there. Next slide, please, Sophie. And this slide applies the same approach to selected occupational areas to show what's happening with those. And we've limited it to a few selected occupations to keep the chart less busy and avoid sort of overload within the chart. But it uses the same index as a basis for comparison, looking at what's happened since the restrictions were lifted. And again, you can see a decline during December for all of these selected occupational areas. The timing varies slightly, and I think that's because some of the occupations were affected more by Christmas than by Omicron. But we can also see the start of what hopefully is a sustained recovery in January, including for the hospitality sector, which is obviously the sector that you would see as being most exposed to Omicron and Plan B measures, to restrictions and behaviour change. So that sort of concludes my slides. So I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Peter. Really helpful presentation. Are there any questions and comments, please? Peter, would you like to come in?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Chair. And again, Peter, thanks for the presentation. Very interesting and illuminated. Just on the point around higher level apprenticeships. So you showed the slide showing the trend there. One thing I think for the committee that you may be aware of is that the Universities Minister has and the Office for Students have asked universities to revise their access and participation plans with a view to looking to boost the number of higher and degree apprenticeships. Of course, devil is in the detail around that, and in particular how those things might be funded, but it's just something perhaps to bear in mind for this committee going forward, Chair.
Thank you, Peter. Are there any more questions and comments? Colin, please.
Yeah, just again on the apprenticeship numbers, I think in the report, the number of young people in apprenticeships, so 16 to 19-year-olds in apprenticeships had fallen, and the number of intermediate apprentices had fallen. And I think that was commented in relation to the pandemic, but those trends were apparent before the pandemic and were and are actually mainly driven by the introduction of the apprenticeship levy, and as we've just commented, the increase in higher level apprenticeships and people in employment in apprenticeships. So that's a national trend and a long-term trend that isn't necessarily impacted on by the pandemic. It's other factors that are driving that. So apprenticeships are becoming less about a young person's first job, and that's a national picture. I don't know whether people have views about it, but that's where we are, and that's what's been happening.
Thank you, Colin. Nav, would you like to come in, please?
Yeah, so I was going to make the same point as Colin, and I'd add to it by saying there's been a government decision to remove level 2 apprenticeships, level 2 being intermediary apprenticeships, and that first step to a job opportunity has gone by design, and not a good thing, I don't think, but I think the committee needs to be aware of it. And just one thing, as system leaders, I suppose the most worrying thing in everything that Peter said was there was loads of positive stuff, recovery coming, job opportunities, and yet still the claimant count is higher. It's substantially higher than it was before the pandemic. So the jobs are there, but more people are in seclusion. And just backed up with no evidence, but from what I see within my own institution is I worry that there's a whole host of people that are staying inside their doors and refusing to come out for trepidation or worry about the pandemic or whatever. And so when we put on courses for the unemployed, for example, with guaranteed job outcomes, pretty much as long as you get through the course, and we're getting minimal people attending. So even though the claimant rate is up, you'd expect those kind of courses to be attracting a lot of applicants. And I have no solutions. I just mention it as an observation that there's a, I hesitate to use the word tsunami, but there's a whole host of issues and challenges that are keeping people at home, and I think as system leaders we need to be worried about them.
Thank you, Nav. Tim, would you like to come in, please?
Yeah, thanks, James. Just on those worrying figures on NEETs, which we didn't look at in detail this time because they've not changed since last time, but it's possibly worth noting, the committee noting that the first national level analysis of early intervention for people who are vulnerable to becoming NEET has just been launched, led by researchers at the University of Huddersfield with us, a very big project funded by the Leverhulme Trust. There may be something to be gained from joining combined authority and district level contacts up with that project team where that's not already in place.
Great, thank you, Tim. I can see a few more hands. I can see Bill and Colin have put their hands up. I just wondered if Peter or any of the officers want to come back at this point, or shall I move on to Bill and Colin? I don't want too many sort of questions and comments picked up before we move on to more comments from the committee.
So yeah, I think we'd accept all of those comments, particularly the one about the intermediate and under 19 apprenticeships. So those trends do indeed sort of predate the pandemic, but if anything have been intensified by it. But certainly on the NEETs point, we'll follow up the suggestion of making contact with the project team.
Thank you. Bill, would you like to come in, please?
Yeah, just a bit of evidence that we come across really from union points of view is that the level of apprentice pay is affecting recruitment to pensions, to apprenticeships, particularly with lots of jobs in retail, been advertised since the restrictions have started to be lifted. Young people can get, 12 quid an hour instead of 4 quid an hour, stocking shelves at Sainsbury's or whatever. And there seems to be a bit of a drift away from apprenticeships, short minded in some respects, but you can understand why kids want, 12 quid instead of 4 quid. So we really need to look at apprenticeship pay, I think. We started doing that with our colleagues in South Yorkshire around real minimum wage for apprenticeships. But there's certainly a lot of £4 jobs there, which, would you take one if you were 16 or 17? Just a point. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. Colin, would you like to come in, please?
Yeah, just picking up on Tim's comment around a slide that we didn't look at because it's remained the same, which is the percentage of young people who are NEET. Interesting trend on that one, which obviously I'm interested in, is the underlying trend there year on year is that the number of NEETs in Leeds are going up, whilst in most other authorities they were going down. Which is an interesting, I have a view about that, why that is, and it's around capacity in the post-16 system, but just an interesting and contrasting piece of data.
Thank you, Colin. I know we've talked about that before, particularly in Leeds. Alex, would you like to come in, please?
Yeah, just a couple of points on the apprenticeship side. I am actually on a working group with the Department for Education looking at why 16 to 18-year-old uptake is so low, and they're really calling for some recommendations. So I know NAB says he didn't have a solution, but if there are any solutions that I can feed into that group, they've got a working group of providers and a working group of young people. Some of the recommendations or changes that are needed that have come up already is around further investment in pre-apprenticeship programs or apprenticeship traineeships, financially incentivising progression onto apprenticeships, disincentivising adults in work. So I think Colin's point or Nav's point was that there are a lot more people in work that are doing apprenticeships now as opposed to a transition into work, and also a piece around the financial aspect and actually not having an apprenticeship minimum wage, or at least for 16 to 18-year-olds, looking at the benefit issue. And 16 to 18-year-olds that go on to an apprenticeship, it stops their parents' benefits. So there's quite a lot at the moment being discouraged from going on to apprenticeships and encouraged into other things. So if there are any kind of solutions or recommendations people want to feed in that can go into that working group, happy to kind of be a vessel for that. And then just on the NEET thing quickly, I do sit on a couple of the NEET groups, and there is a rise in the not knowns. So I guess what I'm asking is, how are we finding those not knowns? We're seeing a report in the rise in NEETs, but we're also seeing a report in the data of not known where they are. And I think, like Nav's point, it is a very real concern that people aren't leaving their houses, and they're just not doing anything and taking these self-imposed gap years until it becomes less risky to go into employment or training or education or whatever it might be. So I think there's a bit more work we need to do at a local level on the whole not known space as well.
Thanks, Alex. I think the not known, I mean, just with from a Leeds Council perspective, the not knowns are a concern to us, because some of it is, as people have said, you know, people who are effectively sitting out the pandemic, there are potentially a little bit more concern about some of the numbers in some of the areas. The numbers are high, and it's maybe not quite as benign reasons. I don't see anybody else. Colin, do you want to come back in again, or shall we?
No, that was a legacy hand. Apologies. Okay,
all right. So shall we? That was a really useful item, and thanks, Pete and everybody, for the presentation and the contributions, and obviously we'll note the report. Shall we move on to item 9 in the integrated care workforce strategy, please, Phil?
Hello, everybody. So I'm just introducing this item, which we've got Johnny both from the local NHS and also colleagues from Breaking Barriers Innovations who are going to do a presentation. But what this is about in our framework, we've talked about health and social care skills, and this is talking to you about some work that's already going on that we can potentially be involved as a partner with, looking at this area in more detail. John, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Councillor Lewis. I know Phil said NHS, we are the ICP, so we are the Integrated Care Partnership for the region, clearly of which WICA is part of. And I think really, Phil has covered it. I was going to introduce the item fairly quickly, but I know we're short of time, so I won't say very much other than this is a really collaborative piece to kind of use evidence-based approach to develop shared action across institutions in the region. And we're leading that work as the ICP, working with WICA and Health Education England. And the challenge ahead of us, which we think there's a real opportunity to influence, is how we get to accessible and progressing good employment across the region. This is not to duplicate existing approaches, but rather to kind of add value to them, help identify where we have some gaps, and together collaboratively pull out some action that we can deliver across the piece. So we kind of just started this piece of work early days, but we thought it was important to bring this to you as a piece of work that cuts across skills and employment, obviously, and to make sure you're fully plugged into what we're trying to do. So I won't say any more than that, because we've got Breaking Barriers Innovations on that will take us through the detail of the what we're calling West Yorkshire kind of program playbook. So Nick, if I hand over to you, is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
We can take questions at the end if when we come to it. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks very much, and pleasure to present to everyone today. And
honoured to have not one but two introductions for my piece. I think we've got about 15 minutes in total, so I'll keep the presentation to just shy of 10 minutes, and I shall share my screen, and hopefully that comes up okay. Brilliant. And what I'll do, I'll cover two things. I'll cover the introduction to the Breaking Barriers playbook, which is what we're doing across the country at the moment. And
sorry, Nick, can I just stop you
Yes.
there? And if you think you're sharing your screen, I can't see anything. I don't know if anybody else can.
Sorry.
No, it's not sharing, Nick, I'm afraid.
Let me try that one more time.
That's great. I can see. I can see
Is
it
it
now.
working now?
Other people see it.
So I've got so used to using Teams that Zoom has become an exotic thing for me to do. Brilliant. Yeah, so thanks, James. So yeah, two quick things. I'll go through what Breaking Barriers is doing around the country, primarily with health partners, but increasingly with local government and wider public sector partners. And then secondly, a structure of the playbook that we're organising with the ICS and Health Education England at the moment in West Yorkshire. I'll preface all of this by saying that what you're going to say you might see this as a very health-focused programme. That's not quite true. This is a place-based approach. We start off with health because we're looking at the social determinants of health, employment, good education, training, skills, good access to employment through good infrastructure, all part of these. And we're very much focused around the experience of the user. So not just thinking it through the view of a top-down system approach, but seeing any intervention which we're trying to complete, doing it very, very early on with the experience of the existing workforce, the unemployed, the people working within the system around initiatives at the moment, to make sure we've got a very well-rounded, accurate approach to what we're doing. But very briefly, we actually established Breaking Barriers I think 6 years ago, perhaps 5 years ago. It was around the time of Brexit, that's what I remember. And it actually began in Bradford. Lord Patel of Bradford was the founding partner of Breaking Barriers. He wanted to do a vision for Bradford about how you could bring the regeneration strategy from the City Council at the time closer in line with what the health partners were trying to do, to see if we could make more sense of doing things together and planning things now. And there was a report from that. And that report, it was slightly groundbreaking at the time because we attempted to do it from the perspective of not only the policymaker, who might have to consider recommendations, but we actually saw it from the vantage point of the user, the workforce, the people, having to procure new ways of doing things. And we brought it all together within 3 months, that sort of clear vision about what would make change happen at a place-based level. And from that, there was a lot of interest, because what we found from the production of the report was that people were spending lots of time doing pilots, reports, going to meetings, thinking about change, but there was not sufficient evidence about why a place-based approach is better than the siloed approach way of doing things. So we began as an organisation, Breaking Barriers Innovations, going around the country. We did some work in Greater Manchester around criminal justice devolution. This was at a time where they were getting those enhanced powers around criminal justice. I'm thinking, again, if you have a longer term view about this, and if you bring everything together, where would you invest the money in terms of interventions and keeping people away from prisons or prison police cells? And we're doing lots of different bits of work around the country. There's lots of evidence around this on our website, but it was the one which we did 3 years ago in West Lancashire at CCG, where the chief officer there said, basically, I want to do something around housing, but I wouldn't know where to start. And what his challenge for us was, I've got 25% of my patients with COPD, so chronic obstruction pulmonary disease at the moment, coming from one housing estate in Skelmersdale. And I know as an NHS organisation, if I could spend money on this, whatever the solution would be, that would give me the best return on investment, but I wouldn't know where to start. And that challenge led us to developing with Health Education England and West Lancashire, the thing which we're undertaking around the country at the moment, including West Yorkshire, the idea of a playbook for place. And very simply, it's about getting to that red box, which is that place-based approach, which delivers, and we've got the evidence that every time we do it, it's actually sustaining the system or bringing extra value. And we can, it basically encourages our organizations to do that. And on the left-hand side, we've got where we are now, because place is a very, very nice thing, but it doesn't have a budget. And what we want to do is actually make the case for the private sector, the public sector, the NHS, the local authority, that this approach around sustainable employment, if you're talking to a health director, or looking at focusing on the social determinants of health, if you're talking to a local authority economic development officer, it's all two sides of the same coin. We can't divide our approaches to health and wealth. And if we don't do that, we're going to end up duplicating a lot of efforts, not seeing the true value of all of our assets playing together within the same sandbox. So our approach is to try to get to that red box. We recognize all of the barriers from our hard-won experience and trying to do place-based approaches. And we recognize them, and therefore we're going to try and overcome them. The biggest challenge is place-based approach. It feels like a nice thing to do, but should we be doing it now when we've just coming out of the pandemic? We've got significant economic challenges, as your last presenter eloquently took us through. Why should we be doing this now? And so our approach is to actually see this new approach as actually being part of the present focus, not something for next generations to deal with. So the playbook has got 4 clear building blocks. Number one, let's not try to do everything all at the same time. We need clear focus for this. We're not saying just do one thing, but focus upon the one thing which the local area, the system, the combined authority region can all identify. That's all of our problem, and that's the gap which we're clearly not addressing now. And don't create more research for this, because we're awash with reports, data, which actually is giving us the evidence about where we should be pointing towards. And the reason that we do the Spurs building block is that if you're doing something theoretically, structurally, it basically never gets off the ground. We've got to get things which get commitment at a very, very early level from a range of senior directors. And once you've identified that strategic focus, it's about 2 other things. Start bringing the discussions as early as possible to the residents, the communities, but not just a consultation exercise. It's about community engagement, community empowerment. So what we do in terms of what our plans are for West Yorkshire is actually train peer researchers for whatever the challenge is to actually go out and do the research for us, tell us the lived experience of their neighbourhoods, their communities, about how the intervention would most make a difference, rather than doing that very top-down approach to an organic, place-based community model. And then the third building block, which we do at the same time, is actually see it from the lens of the workforce. And that workforce isn't the NHS, it's not the public sector, it's the workforce which is relevant to the challenge, whether it's the private sector, the voluntary sector, the public sector. And again, what we're not trying to do is try to do that top-down approach. We're not thinking of lots of senior management team meetings. We're trying to get the experience of that individual working within the system who's tried to do this new thing. They've got their existing workload to do. So actually how we can actually make that easy for them. And longer term, if this difference is making a change, do we actually need a slightly different workforce to reflect this? And then the final aspect of the program, the playbook program, is don't end up with a strategy report, a vision statement, end up with a series of actions, and some of those actions can be taken immediately, because basically it could be simply about actually bringing existing plans together into a more meaningful whole. Parts of the system recognizing that what they're doing over there is actually already happening, and that should be better to actually focus on this particular area, which is an actual significant gap. We can look at some of the bigger investment models, longer term, if it is basically, if we're focusing upon sustainable employment, if it's about digital infrastructure, transport, linking certain communities closer to where opportunity is. But we've got to start off with recognition that a lot of these things is about bringing existing plans, pooling things together, and making sure that we've got something which can be sustained. So that's a very, very quick rundown of most of the things which we're doing as an organisation at the moment. We've been working on the playbook across different parts of the country for 2.5 years now, supported by NHS England, who are very interested in this from approach of reducing health inequalities around the country, and the recognition that good employment is part of that. We're working also around the levelling up unit in terms of actually how this actually brings opportunities in terms of employment closer. And if we can think of health as one of those pipelines of opportunity, if we think about the new changes, the transformative changes across health and life sciences over the next couple of decades, that could be one significant opportunity. And we're also working with Health Education England, who I know will be merged very soon with NHS England, that have a significant role to play at the moment in terms of service transformation. The work in West Yorkshire at the moment, which we've been developing with John and colleagues such as Sarah at the ICP, is looking at an employment-focused project. It slightly parallels the work which we're doing in Somerset, which is around creating a health and care pathway, which I don't have time to present to today, but I'm very happy to present at another session because I think it is quite relevant. And we began this work at the end of last year, but we're in that phase 1 process at the moment where we're trying to define what this place-based intervention meaningfully looks like for system leaders in West Yorkshire. So we're trying to get to that long-term potential goal in West Yorkshire. So in terms of the green box, which I feel, based upon conversations we've had today, is around actually how can we provide that long-term support for suppliers, skill providers and the system, how we can actually measure the evaluation, not just from the perspective of place, but from a perspective of a HR directorate, a workforce directorate within health, which obviously has different current agendas than, say, the local authority economic development teams. And also potentially, could some of the work which health is doing at the moment, whether it's around transforming the support for the care sector, whether it's about looking about genomics, whether it's looking at the life sciences industry, could some of those, if we actually articulate them in a slightly longer term viewpoint and actually market them in a different way, could those actually be magnets for outside investors, in addition to having a good sustainable workforce with the skills provided? So that's the very broad outline which we're attempting to navigate. We've got 3 clear actions over the next 3 months. I think we're aiming to complete this first phase by the end of April. But that first phase 1 is very much looking at the existing evidence out there at the moment. We're wading through dozens, if not hundreds, of existing reports and plans at the moment, looking at where does that alignment closely go to? Where are people actually talking about something over there, and actually someone's having a very, very significant dialogue over there about the same thing, but they're not linked? Or where is the true gap in terms of the system interventions, which people are always talking about, but no one's actually tackling? So that is the very, very first wave, which is underway at the moment, and we're very, very keen to have further conversations with anyone on call around that particular phase, because it is based upon these sorts of discussions. We're beginning to think about actually where does that take us in terms of if we're going down an employment, training and skills routes, but subdividing that into 4 areas of inquiry, looking at system leadership in terms of what potential opportunities are there available at a system level which are presenting to us in the next 12 months to 10 years. Secondly, looking at where this sits in terms of national alignment. Can we actually access additional support from national organisations to support this programme going forward? We really, really want to get into the space of the regional employers and not just end up in discussions just with the statutory sector, but get that viewpoint. Are there commonalities in the private sector as well? And in addition, in West Yorkshire, you have got a number of headquarters, Whitehall departments here as well, which I think makes you additionally potentially interesting. And lastly, looking at from the perspective of, are there gaps within education and skills providers at the moment? So that's where the lens is pointing to at the moment in terms of this programme. In terms of the final stage of this phase 1, we'll be bringing the evidence together into a report. We'll be setting out the evaluation metrics for it. In terms of going beyond this phase, the next part of the research has to be done by the communities itself. So we'll be advising what would be a good representative number of community engagement projects should happen in terms of phase 2, and which voluntary organisations should be leading those projects and why. And we want to basically understand at a system level, whether it's 2 organisations or 50 organisations across West Yorkshire, how we would agree the metrics for evaluating this project in the long term. So I'm not sure if I've overstayed or understayed my welcome, but I shall stop sharing now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Shall I, if that's the end of the presentation, I'll see if anybody has any questions or comments. Yes, please. Got Cryer JE. Sorry, I don't know.
Apologies, I think our Zoom doesn't work terribly well. So it's Jenny Cryer from Bradford. So
hi, Jenny.
Councillor Khan. Hi. Just a very brief comment. It all looks very exciting. I haven't had time to look at it in detail because I'm covering for Councillor Khan. I suppose my question would be about how this fits with some of the really deep system engagement and work that's being done across the health and care partnerships. I know certainly in Bradford that Professor Shelley Congdon's leading with lots of partners, and I'm aware of similar work in Leeds. So I just, in the spirit of which we're trying to create system simplicity, aren't we? And really, build on the assets that we've got. I'm just kind of interested in how this fits. I know you've spoken with colleagues in Bradford, so I know it's not about not engaging, but it's about whether there's a level of duplication in there that is potentially could be a challenge.
Very good point. I mean, part of our focus is to make sure that we don't duplicate anything. We're actually looking at where the gaps are beyond phase one. We are engaging with Shirley. She sits on the people board, I believe, John, as well. So she's advising us of anything which is already current. But no, we're very, very clear on avoiding things which are already underway. But very good point. I'm not sure if John, if you've got a further point to make on that.
No, thanks, Jenny. I think that's a really well-made point, which is why phase one is all about going out and talking to stakeholders, having a clear understanding of what's out there and making sure that we're not just duplicating existing work. And the evidence gathering is doing exactly that. So I think Shelley is part of the communication that Nick has been doing. And on the people board for the ICP, we have good representation. And the people that have been spoken to across the region so far are beginning to understand clearly what this is and what this isn't. There's no point in doing this just to duplicate what's already existing. It's to add value to what's already there. So I think that point is well made. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, John. Alex, would you like to come in, please?
Yeah, so we're leading the health and social care strand of the Skills Connect offer across West Yorkshire, which is the free skills training for adults across West Yorkshire. So really keen to find out more, really. And I've sent the link to your report to my colleague who's leading on it. But again, we're working with our skills providers who are going out to private and public sector care, health and social care, NHS, local organisations to find out what their skills needs are. So then we can look to adapt that and fund that through our Skills Connect programme. So again, we don't want to be bombarding local care organisations or strategic partners or stakeholders with similar questions about their skills needs on a local level. So it'd be really good to maybe have a separate meeting to find out what it is that you guys are doing and how that complements or adds to what we're doing through the Skills Connect programme, because that is kind of free funded, dedicated to growth and reskilling, retraining within healthcare, health and social care and NHS. So again, it's just that complement and avoiding duplication piece.
Just come back on that, Alex. I was listening to what you were saying on the last call, and it sounds like you might be a perfect organisation in terms of the phase two community engagement work, in terms of providing some of the cohorts for that. So we'd be really keen to follow up. Do you cover the entirety of West Yorkshire in terms of your?
Yeah. I think my colleague Kelly has met with John a couple of times to talk about our NHS passport that we're looking at developing. But again, it's just good to make sure that we're all singing off the same hymn sheet locally, isn't it, when we're talking about skills needs and developments. So that'd be great to be involved. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Peter, would you like to come in, please?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And I know, John, we've talked a few times about the work of the ICS and the health and care sector. This clearly sort of seems to me what you've presented, Nick, fits with the whole agenda around anchor institutions, and obviously universities have got a key role in that. I wasn't quite clear, though, from the presentation, the sort of relationship to the Combined Authorities report, which talks about an integrated care strategy for West Yorkshire. So I just wondered, there seemed to be a bit of a disconnect there for me, that what you were presenting, Nick, was a more broader kind of programme looking at the role of the health and care workforce in addressing health inequalities. But then this kind of combined authority kind of covering report looked to be quite sort of specific. And it comes back to the earlier point with colleague from Bradford was talking about. I think we just need to be clear about the definitions and perhaps the communications.
Thank you, Peter.
Absolutely, and I think we've actually this is our first proper presentation to the combined authority on a formal basis, Peter. So we've had, I think, John, we've had some discussions with colleagues at BICA, but we're keen to actually accelerate that so we don't fall into that trap.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing, Nick, is perhaps a bit more work for us to do around kind of some clarity between what's existing, both in terms of WICA and across the region, to make sure these are properly connected. We can do that. I think that's fine.
I think, sorry to dive in. I work with Nick and do the kind of day-to-day operational management of the West Yorkshire project. And I think a couple of people have raised the really valid and important point about not duplicating. And I just wanted to say, as a bit of a safeguard against that, this programme has a working group that meets fairly regularly. And that's a diverse membership. It's made up of various organisations across all the regions. So I think what they're able to do is to give us that heads up that if we are steering into an area that has already had attention on it, that we're not duplicating and we're doing something else. And one of the more medium-term objectives of that steering group is to identify 2 or 3 smaller locations within the region where we can really kind of knuckle down and conduct that engagement. And again, that steering group's really effective in that, because our aim is to target the smaller locations that perhaps haven't received as much attention, and therefore obviously decrease the likelihood that we're duplicating in any area that has received quite a bit of attention.
Great, thank you, George. I don't see anybody else who'd like to come in on this item. So I know the recommendation is to note the report and ask that that's taken forward. So we'll move on to our last item, please, Phil, which is the Mayoral Pledges.
Thank you, Chair. Very conscious of time, and this isn't going to be a long item because many of the points have already been covered on earlier items on the agenda. So just going through a few things to update on. The first one I was going to update on was the pledge on the 1,000 well-paid green jobs for young people. And the thing I was going to update was this morning's Green Jobs Task Force, which many people on this committee were at, and Rashik and Michelle gave a really good overview of that at the start of this meeting. Once I finish giving my item of any other people, I see Alex as well was on this morning, would like to add anything to what was said earlier, then very, very happy. But I think it was a really good first meeting at the beginning of our 1 year of progress, and some really, really good feedback on what we're going to do next, and some areas that we need to kind of focus more on. In terms of the other item, just to update on briefly, on digital skills. So this meeting happened at the same time as or the same day as our digital skills partnership meeting. And just the committee needs to be aware that the next meeting, we're going to be bringing something more detailed on the digital skills plan, and that'll be presented at the next meeting. And on the Digital Innovation Festival, that is going to be linked to the wider Innovation Festival, and that's being scoped for this summer. I don't want to add anything else on this item, really, really conscious of time, but very, very happy for a discussion, particularly on the Green Jobs Task Force as it was this morning.
Thank you, Phil. Does anybody else want to come in on this item, please? I don't see anybody else's hand up. So on that point, thank you for that report, Phil. That brings us to the end of this afternoon's informal consultative meeting, and obviously as picked up during the meeting where this committee has not agreed anything but made recommendations to the Combined Authority Managing Director for Ben Still to take decisions under his delegated powers, that will be passed on, and we'll confirm the minutes of the October meeting and this at the next meeting. So with that, I will thank everybody who's presented, thank everybody who's attended, and close today's meeting.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.